Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Dwight Eisenhower, and the focus is covert action and domestic successes. The year is 1953. In our last episode, we introduced Ike's New Look defense program, which is about going big, massive retaliation, doubling down on nuclear weapons as a deterrent to make sure that they would keep the war a Cold War and not turn it into a hot war while keeping communism in check. This was the big strategy, largely focused on the Department of Defense. But the Eisenhower administration also showed they could go small to try to affect some pretty big outcomes. And for that, they would do it secretly with the Central Intelligence Agency, and in fact, for the first time in American history, they would use the CIA to topple sovereign governments in a couple of cases, ostensibly again to keep communism out. The first case is in Iran. In the last year of the Truman administration, Dr. Mossadegh became the prime minister of Iran, and he had some reform agenda in mind, particularly the relationship with Great Britain and Middle East oil, Iranian oil obviously in particular. The British and the Iranians had had an agreement since 1933 where the Brits came in with a whole bunch of upfront investment, they would run the oil industry, and they would recoup most of the proceeds. And for Mossadegh, 20 years into this agreement, said, look, this isn't working for us. It's our oil, and yet we're only getting 16% of the proceeds. We got to renegotiate. And the British said, no, we've got a 60-year agreement. We lived up to our end of the bargain. You have to do the same. Well, Mossadegh said that's not going to happen. He unilaterally nationalized the Iranian oil industry and told the British you either renegotiate or you get out and you get nothing. Well, the Brits came to the United States and said, look, we got a problem here, and it just isn't about an oil contract for us. This is about communism. If the West falters in Iran, it's going to create a vacuum and some instability, and the communists are going to come in, and all that oil in the Middle East, it's going to end up in the coffers of the communists. We can't let that happen. Mr. President, what are you going to do? Initially, Eisenhower said, look, I'm not going to bite on this. I'm going to remain neutral. But he had some people in his administration that pushed him in the other direction, including the Dulles brothers. John Foster Dulles is the Secretary of State. His younger brother, Alan, is the director of the CIA, and said, look, Mr. President, we can't let that happen. It would create instability. The communists will come in. And look, we have an alternative. Let's just foment a coup. Let's topple Mossadegh. We'll do it quietly behind the scenes, put somebody friendly in there, and this problem will entirely go away. Well, they went back and forth on it for a little while, and Eisenhower eventually said, okay. In June of 1953, he's thinking about if you let one fall, it all could fall in the Middle East, the domino principle. You have the broader consideration of what might follow, he said, what you would call the following domino principle. You have a row of dominoes set up, you knock over the first one, and what will happen to the last one is the certainty that it will go over very quickly. He was worried about that, so he took the unprecedented step to authorize the attempted coup that would be fomented by the CIA. How would they actually do this? For the United States, never done it before. They had a man on the ground, Kermit Roosevelt Jr. He's the grandson of the former president, Theodore Roosevelt. And he had some steps that he was going to take to try to get this thing going. The first was to speak to the sovereign, the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, and get him on board. He said, look, if we topple Mossadegh and put somebody friendly in place there, then we are going to have better relations with the United States. This will be good for Iran going forward. And after a little convincing, the Shah was basically on board. They had to find the person then to replace Mossadegh. And for that, they found a friendly general, Fazlollah Zahedi, who said, yep, if this happens, I'll be waiting in the wings. You want to put me in as prime minister? I'll be happy to do that, and certainly will be friendly to the United States. Well, from there, Roosevelt sort of kicked things up from his ability to foment this by actually paying people to go to rallies to criticize the Mossadegh administration, saying that it was bringing ruin to Iran. It's going to create instability, and these protests kept rising and rising to the point where the Shah felt he had enough top cover to actually have Mossadegh arrested. That opened the opportunity for Zahedi to emerge. He became the prime minister. It was a little bit messy for a couple of weeks, but it all came through in the end, and Eisenhower said, look, this is a great outcome. It wasn't all that hard as long as we could keep it a secret. He wrote in his diary, the things we did were covert. If knowledge of them became public, we would not only be embarrassed in that region, but our chances to do anything of like nature in the future would almost totally disappear. And for his sake, it was good because it was kept a secret. In fact, he gave a medal to Kermit Roosevelt Jr., obviously done in total secrecy. In fact, he now had a new weapon in his toolkit in case something like this popped up somewhere else, and it didn't take long for that to happen. That same year, closer to home, Central America in Guatemala. They have a new president. Jocobo Arbenz was elected. Again, a reformer. Land reform was the principal interest of Arbenz, which was very important to the people of Guatemala, and the United Fruit Company was very much at odds. The UFC was the largest industry in all of Guatemala, not only strong and powerful in Guatemala, but they also had a lot of powerful friends and backers in the United States, including in the United States government, and they said this land reform isn't going to work very well. Here's what Arbenz was actually proposing. He's going to take land, unused land from businesses and individuals around the country, and he would compensate those organizations from the government, but he would then reallocate that land to the people so that they could have some land of their own. And the UFC basically said, well, this is clearly communistic. This reallocation of land is classic communism. And United States, are you going to stand for this? This isn't going to be good. If you let the communists come in to Guatemala, the domino principle, they'll take over all of Central America. You'll have communists right on your doorstep. Now, there wasn't a lot of evidence that there were communists actually behind this, but that statement very much resonated within the CIA, and they convinced Eisenhower once again that it's okay to go forward with yet another coup. This is now August of 1953 when everything got started. The one thing he said to the guys is, look, you better make it work. I want all of you to be damn good and sure you succeed, he told them. I'm prepared to take any steps that are necessary to see that it succeeds. When you commit the flag, you commit it to win. So what did that mean? Well, they only had kind of a small budget, which was maybe a poor start. Started training some rebels in both Florida and in Honduras. They acquired 3 airplanes to create a mini air force. One of the big things they did is they stood up a fake radio station to start driving the psychological warfare, talking about the instability in the Arbenz government and the problems that his land policies were creating, and forecasting violence if the people don't do something about this and maybe overturn him. And the threats from the United States were being broadcast as well. The U.S. isn't going to like this. Maybe they're going to send in their army to create fear and unrest in the streets of Guatemala. Well, when Ike gave the final go-ahead of this in June of 1954, it started out pretty slowly. First of all, they lost the use of 2 of the planes almost immediately, and the rebels came in, but they only went in a couple of miles, didn't go very far, so this thing is not going all that well. Ike is thinking it's going to fail, and so he agreed to acquire 2 more airplanes from Nicaragua, a friendly country in the area who was in on this coup, and then they started initiating some bombing runs in the major cities. The rebels advanced a little more, but mostly it was that psychological warfare, the broadcasting from that radio station in Florida, talking about, look, if you guys resist, the Americans are going to come in next. And that's the message that really hit home with the army. The Guatemalan army could easily have defeated this sort of fake army coming in from these handful of rebels, a couple hundred people. That would not have been a big problem. But the expectation was that this was a much bigger invasion that was coming, and the Americans were going to be behind it. And the Guatemalan army said, look, I'm not taking on the Americans. Mr. Arbenz, you're on your own. They would not defend the Arbenz government. At that point, he had no choice. He felt to resign, and he was replaced by someone friendly to the Americans, General Carlos Armas. Well, General Armas was brutal against the Arbenz supporters. He didn't find any communists in this group, which is, again, not all that surprising. And it actually led to decades of some guerrilla warfare and a series of military dictatorships. It really didn't help the people of Guatemala at all. But Eisenhower felt this was another success. And he said so rather disingenuously in his statement to the public. The people of Guatemala, in a magnificent effort, have liberated themselves from the shackles of international communist direction. They have reclaimed their right of self-determination. Well, that's not really what happened. This was a coup initiated by the United States in covert action, but it was effective, even though it was in unprecedented action by the United States. Now, the United States is leery of communism expansion across the world. We've talked about examples in Europe, in the Middle East, the Americas, and of course the Far East as well, where the United States had a war recently ended with Korea, and now there's some action going on in Indochina, where the states of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia exist. Prior to World War II, this was all a French colony. Japan had taken over Indochina during World War II. Now they were out, and the French wanted their colonial powers back, but the people in these states wanted independence, particularly in Vietnam, where they started fighting the French for that independence behind Ho Chi Minh. They were aligned with the communists. So what did the French do? They asked the United States for help. And Eisenhower looked at this. Well, he was sympathetic. France had been an ally in World War II, but he was reluctant because he had never been a big fan of European colonialism, which was basically happening here. And he thought the right move, actually, is to give these states in Indochina their independence. The U.S. military was saying, let's go in and bomb and maybe even use nuclear weapons to aid the French. And Ike said, look, we're not doing that. In fact, we'll send some weapons, but we're not going to send nuclear weapons, and no boots on the ground, so very limited support as things came to a head in March of 1954. At that point, the French consolidated their forces in a place called Dien Bien Phu, and this turned out to be a pretty big mistake. The Vietnamese knew the land better than the French. They initiated a siege, then were attacking, they were making inroads. The French appealed to the United States, but Ike said, look, I'm not getting engaged militarily on this. The garrison of the French fell, and the French actually got out of Vietnam and were out for good. The Americans helped negotiate a settlement that actually split the country, kind of like what had been done in Korea. So north of a certain line is going to be communist under Ho Chi Minh. South Vietnam is going to go under Ngo Diem, who's going to be friendly to the United States. U.S. would give assistance to Diem for a number of years. Still pretty tense and unstable situation, and certainly the issues in Vietnam would linger for a long period of time. Couple years in now to his administration, this is not an easy job for Dwight Eisenhower, both physically as well as sort of mentally. All the demands on his job. He actually confided in Bernard Montgomery, the general from the British that he had worked with closely, sometimes at odds with during World War II, and he told Monty that no man on earth knows what this job is all about. It's pound, pound, pound. Not only is your intellectual capacity taxed to the utmost, but your physical stamina was kind of unrelenting. Ike is trying to pace himself, cut off his days a little bit earlier, not bring work home, have some kind of relaxation. Well, he had the gang that we talked about in a previous episode that he could call upon to play bridge with, or certainly to play golf. He would go down to Augusta National or play in Washington, D.C. He didn't play more golf than any president in American history. That goes to Woodrow Wilson. But Ike certainly played a lot of golf, again, in different locations with the gang and all. And his doctor, Howard Snyder, said, that's a really good thing. Without golf, he'd be like a caged lion with all those tensions building up inside him. If this fellow couldn't play golf, I'd have a nutcase on my hands. But Ike was severely criticized for all this golfing. He said he was lazy. It's all play and no work. And it was a surprise person to come out and to actually rebut this, to come on Ike's side, because Harry Truman, his predecessor, certainly had no love lost at this point for Dwight Eisenhower. But he said, look, to criticize the president because he plays a game of golf is unfair and picayunish. He has the same right to relax from the heavy burdens of office as any other man. He would continue to play golf. He would continue to be criticized. His favorability still sitting in the 60% plus range. The people in this country still liked Eisenhower a couple of years in, but they did lose badly in the midterms. The Republicans lost the majority in both the House and the Senate to the Democrats. And in a way, Ike wasn't all that hard up about this because he knew Sam Rayburn, the new Speaker of the House, and he knew Lyndon Johnson, the new majority in the Senate. And in some areas, he actually was more aligned with them, with his middle way of governance, than he was the right wing of his party, particularly on foreign policy, balanced budgets, and also a couple of pet projects, a couple of civil works initiatives that had lasting impact for the country. You know, Ike was conservative when it came to money, but he was also willing to invest. And two major public works projects were initiated on his watch. The first was one that the people of New York had been trying to get in place for about 30 years. Way back when Franklin Roosevelt was the governor of New York, he was trying to get a seaway built using the St. Lawrence River to expand the capabilities to bring goods from the Midwest to the Atlantic Ocean far beyond what the Erie Canal was able to accomplish. But they had always run into roadblocks. The Canadians would have to be involved in this because a lot of it would be on their side of the border. That never seemed to go well. The railroads, the unions seemed to always put up some kind of a roadblock. But Eisenhower said this is a good project. He got behind it and he got it done. 2,300 miles of distance from Duluth, Minnesota and Lake Superior across 4 others of the Great Lakes all the way to the St. Louis River. That seaway taking to the Atlantic Ocean. This thing today, over 40 million tons of cargo transit on the St. Lawrence Seaway every year. The bigger initiative was actually in the United States entirely and on the roads. The national highway system which bears Eisenhower's name for a very good reason. If you recall the episode earlier, we talked about the transcontinental convoy that Ike was on after World War I back in 1919, where he was exposed to the lack of infrastructure, trying to get a convoy of army trucks from one side of the country to the other. Particularly those roads in between cities just were not very much developed, and things had not changed much in the course of all these decades. Well, Ike also had the experience of having been in Germany to see the Autobahn, which were these modern roads connecting big cities that he thought this is what the United States should have. And so he asked Lucius Clay to put a group together to take a look at this. And Clay came back and said, Ike, you should go big. 41,000 miles of new roads you should build. It's going to cost about $100 billion over 10 years. And Ike is intrigued by this. It's very expensive. So he's trying to figure out how does he pay for it. And they listed a number of options, and they eventually decided on a national gas tax at 4 cents a gallon. And that would eventually pay for this entire infrastructure that eventually, again, would bear his name. Eisenhower said more than any single action by the government since the end of the war, this one would change the face of America. Its impact on the American economy, the jobs it would produce in manufacturing and construction, the rural areas it would open up was beyond calculation. He's exactly right. This made a huge difference in the country. And again, a lot of it was based on that investment, based on what Eisenhower wanted to do with this public works project. This is a taxing couple of years here. He's now into his administration, getting into the 3rd and 4th year of that first term, but he's getting stuff done domestically, foreign. Still got a ways to go. That's the story for another day. That's Dwight Eisenhower and covert action and domestic successes from the life of Dwight Eisenhower. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.